Dan and Amy, or as I'm better known, the Commodore and Amy. Thank you, Ann B. Davis's Bowling Ball, for publishing my list of demands for colleagues and staff here.
Yeah, it was published on the Smoking Gun, and Dan, there's a picture of him with a little kitten that looks like it wants to gouge your eyes out, but it's very telling tale about what you demand here at AM 560. Do you have the list present?
Well,
we'll
we'll gloss over that. We've already discussed it. I don't want to give
Well, you can't discuss it enough because some of it's true.
I don't want to give Ann B. Davis's Bowling Ball too much airtime here. We have to get to serious things. We were talking about K through 12 school systems in the context of that Netflix series, 13 Reasons Why, and the school's involvement with families on that matter of concern. Now, taking one step back to the idea of classical education at the primary and secondary grades, and even classical Christian education. And for some elucidation on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by Chris Perrin, who is the CEO and publisher at Classical Academic Press. Chris, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
So I was referred to you by the principal at St. Francis of Rome in Cicero, Catholic grade school. And apparently you're working with him to fashion the curriculum there. And so what is it exactly that you're trying to reintroduce even into Catholic or Christian schools that isn't presently there?
Yeah, well, we're trying to reintroduce a form of education that really cultivated so many of the great people and minds in this country and in Western civilization for centuries. We're trying to return to a way of educating that was really what education was generally, say, before 1900. And that doesn't mean that we're going back to, say, just blackboards and wax tablets and, neglecting technology. We're just returning to some ideas and some arts that have been kind of evergreen, perennial ideas that always have humanized people and helped them become the fullest versions of themselves, equip them to be great workers, thinkers, servers, citizens, parents.
For example?
Just name any great mind, any great contributor to our culture from, say, before 1920 or so.
Oh. Dan doesn't qualify now.
No, yeah.
Darn it.
Time threshold.
You'll find. Well, let me just cite someone who's pretty well known. Someone like C.S. Lewis. What a great mind, what a great writer, what a great contributor, great author, great teacher. How was C.S. Lewis educated? How was Tolkien educated? How was Thomas Jefferson educated? Even someone like Abraham Lincoln, who got a kind of spotty education in some respects out on the prairie. How was he educated? Well, these people were trained in what we call the liberal arts. But what's in that phrase is still about today. In fact, we refer to colleges that might be a liberal arts college. But really, the phrase the liberal arts has become kind of an echo of an echo. For example, I bet most of you listeners might say, well, I've had something of a liberal arts education. But if you were to ask your average person, what are the liberal arts? Could you give me a list of them? Most people couldn't give you a very confident list. And if you were then to ask, well, why are these arts called liberal? And why are they called arts? And how do they differ from a science or a subject? We don't really remember that anymore. So we're kind of going back to a renewal of the liberal arts, and you might say as well, and the great books, the great texts that have been written over the centuries, and studying them again in order to become a free people, or at least maintain our freedom, or grow in our freedom. So the liberal arts are the arts of freedom.
Yeah, well, what great books and texts should kids be reading at school that have just gone by the wayside?
Well, how do you define a great book? Well,
true.
One person defined a great book as a book that doesn't need to be written again, or a book that, generation after generation is acclaimed as excellent. So, we could come up with lists. There are published lists of various kinds. It's hard to know. There are, I think, really good contemporary books being written, but it's hard to know if a book is going to be great if it's only been out for 10, 20, or 30 years. A classic text is a book that has enduring excellence over time. So I don't think we should not read contemporary literature. I think there's a lot of good contemporary literature being written. But I kind of like what C.S. Lewis said in his essay on the reading of old books. I think it would be better to read, say, 2 old books for every new book. In other words, read a book that's been acclaimed to have enduring excellence. Privilege those books in your reading, and certainly as a part of our education.
Well, right. So and part of this is about the great authors and the great books. I mean, the University of Chicago has like a great book series that you can essentially audit as an adult, but you're essentially, it seems to me, trying to take this and push it down to the grade school level, which, oh, by the way, I applaud. And it seems like the classical liberal education is to get back to the liberal arts, right? Grammar and logic and rhetoric and arithmetic and geometry and music, and I mean that's the and have some connection to the past, so that it informs the present and you think about the future.
Yeah. Well said, Dan. You almost listed all 7 of the liberal arts.
All right. Well, I'll take a emeritus position at the school of your choosing.
So the verbal arts, or grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and those 3 arts enable us to master language, understand language, grammar. The art of interpretation, the structure of language, the syntax of language, all language, so that we can clearly understand, clearly write. Logic is the study of correct reasoning or incorrect reasoning by inference. And rhetoric is the study of persuasive, beautiful speaking and writing. You can win an argument, as you probably know, and not persuade someone because we're not merely logical beings. We're moved because when our emotions are appealed to and not just our minds. So how do we do that? Well, grammar, logic, and rhetoric are the arts of acquiring verbal mastery. When are those arts not practical and helpful? When is it not useful to be able to detect a fallacy when you're encountering, say, commercial advertisements or political propaganda? It's really important that we study logic as a country, as a citizenry, but we don't teach children logic anymore.
How is this effort to return classical education to the classroom being received, even particularly with the advent of alternative schools like charter schools and and then of course the denominational schools?
Yeah, it's a growing renewal. The liberal arts enable us to also access the great books that you were talking about that Chicago has in their core curriculum, the University of Chicago. When we bring the liberal arts back to our schools and the reading of these great texts, we are humanizing ourselves. We're becoming aware of who we are as a people. We're remembering our history. And we're in what Mortimer Adler called a great conversation about the great ideas. These things are very practical and helpful. And as we're doing this, renewing this even imperfectly in our schools, it is creating some really good results.
And part of this necessarily is character formation, isn't it?
Yeah. Because when you're reading the great text, you're reading about virtue. You're reading about nobility. You're learning about what goodness really has been and has been considered. And you necessarily begin to become like what you behold. So we become imitators of the great literature and stories that we encounter. Plus, the study of the liberal arts are build character in and of themselves. Just the learning of a discipline, the learning to think critically, the learning ability to say translate Latin requires a lot of patience, a lot of thoughtful puzzle solving that becomes transferable in scientific work, journalism, and so many different kinds of work and labor and activity. Latin is really the DNA of the West. All of our professions are steeped in Latin vocabulary. but the work of doing Latin is also kind of advanced training in so many different kinds of disciplines. Just to cite that one art, which is of course a grammatical art, the study of Latin. As the schools are beginning to do this, we're seeing some slow transformation. Now, we've been doing it imperfectly. This renewal is only about 30 years old now, going back to renewing the liberal arts and the great books. But it's growing. And the proof is in what parents are seeing in their kids and how they're voting with their feet. Most parents, when they come and look at a local classical school, whether it's a classical Christian school or a classical charter school, and there's about 125 of those that have started, I think there are probably about 500 religious or Christian classical schools that have started. There are many, many thousands, well over 100,000 students being classically homeschooled. There's a large network of homeschooling communities around the country, and those homeschooling communities are not just individual or isolated families. Homeschoolers are now gathering in communities that are starting to look like cottage schools, and some of them actually evolved into what we call typical 5-day schools.
Yeah, hope for Western civilization. He is Chris Perrin, CEO and publisher at Classical Academic Press. Chris, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you. And quickly before we go, let's go to Carrie in Naperville. You're on Chicago's Morning Answer.
Hi, Dan. Hi, Amy.
Hi.
I have a daughter, actually 3 daughters, at Covenant Classical School in Naperville, and I can't say enough about the change in my children and the education that they're receiving, having moved from parochial and public schools to a classical school. The Latin training that starts in 3rd grade, the great books they read, it's amazing.
Great. All right. Thanks for that testimony. I appreciate it, Carrie.
Before you see it on TV, share it on Facebook, or read about it in the paper. Hear it